Pope Leo XIII, an able man who lived up to the age of 93, died on 20th of July 1903. The conclave to elect the next pope opened officially on the evening of the 10th day after the pope's death. At 5 o'clock on the 31st of July, soon after Mass, the cardinals, 62 in number, assembled in the Sistine Chapel to vote for the man whom they saw most worthy and fit to become the next pope. The voting officially began.
Morte del Papa e morte Leone XXIII! Seconda votazione. Reverendissimo signor Cardinale Rampolla, voti 29. Reverendissimo signor Cardinale Gotti, voti 16. Reverendissimo signor Cardinale Sarto, voti 10. Quarta votazione. Reverendissimo signor Cardinale Rampolla, voti 30. Reverendissimo signor Cardinale Sarto, voti 24. Reverendissimo signor Cardinale Gotti, voti 3. Reverendissimo signor Cardinale Sarto, voti 50.
Pope Pius X was born in the little village of Riese on the 2nd of June 1835 as Giuseppe Melchior Sato. He was the second born of 10 children and had 3 brothers and 6 sisters. His parents, Giovanni Battista and his wife Margherita, were poor and sometimes struggled to make both ends meet. Nonetheless, they were hard-working and God-fearing and had the great virtue of being able to suffer patiently and calmly, and these pious parents taught their children to do the same. Sato quickly mastered the first principles of reading and writing, which was all the village school of Riese could offer. He became a fervent and devout altar-server, receiving his first Holy Communion at the age of 11. So quick was his intelligence and so remarkable his aptitude that Don Luigi, who at the time was teaching Latin to his own younger brother, took Beppe, that is, Sato, also as pupil. The boy's progress soon convinced his tutor that he had the makings of a scholar, and the 2 priests determined to prepare him for the grammar school at Castelfranco. He was accepted at the seminary of Padua on the recommendation of the Patriarch of Venice, His Eminence Cardinal Jacopo Monaco. His love of music was unmatched and he was named the director of the seminary choir. At the end of August 1858, Giuseppe Sato's seminary life was over. Sato became a priest on September 18, 1858. The Bishop of Treviso had appointed him curate to Don Antonio Costantini, the parish priest of Tombolo. The village of Tombolo lies in the province of Padua and the diocese of Treviso. Emil Schmitz gives us a beautiful account that most perfectly sums up his priesthood. His sacrifices were for all. He assisted equally the rich and the poor, believer and unbeliever, looking for no other recompense than the resultant good. In this he accomplished innumerable acts of charity, giving himself without. Indeed, to such an extent did he deprive himself of his material possessions for the relief of others, that his dear friends, dwellers in his own household, were obliged to watch him diligently, for although the income from the parish was of sufficient proportions, yet his own was of the poorest, while he was known to sell his very bed in order to satisfy the obligations of charity. Don Giuseppe Sarto, as he was known then, was chosen to give a sermon in the Cathedral of Padua for the feast of St. Anthony of Padua. The sermon lasted over an hour, but no one thought it was too long. One of the congregation wrote to his friend as follows: "His intelligence and culture were no less remarkable than his eloquence. His imagery was beautiful, his style perfect." In May of 1867, he was appointed rector of Salzano, situated in the province of Venetia. His departure from Tombolo was not without its lamentation. His Sunday sermon in Salzano was, just like the one he gave at Padua, one that ignited pure fascination in the minds of the congregation. What was the bishop thinking of? The congregation asked one another as they met when Mass was over. To leave a man like that, buried all these years at a place like Tombolo. He inaugurated catechism classes and classes of Christian doctrine for the adults of the parish. Here again he showed his love for the Gregorian chant. He organized together a voluntary choir of young men and boys, and taught them to sing this beautiful collection of masterpieces. In 1873, there was an outbreak of cholera. This happened when Sarto was serving at Salzano. For fear of infection, the dead had to be buried by night, and no one was allowed to attend the funeral. Anxious lest in the fear and the haste of the moment, due honor should not be paid to these victims of the epidemic, Don Giuseppe was also there to see that all was done as it should be. Not only did he recite the prayer and carry out the ceremonies prescribed by the church on such occasions, but would take his place as coffin bearer and even help to dig the graves. In 1875, Sarto was again forced to leave another of his parish and became the canon in the Cathedral of Treviso, as well as the chancellor of the diocese. He was also appointed spiritual director of the seminary. The great piety with which he assisted at the divine office, the no less great humility with which he scorned all the outward glory of his office, refusing to practice an abuse himself, and correcting abuses in others, while in authority, far from offending his brethren, only raised him in their esteem, so that they applauded with great joy when the bishop promoted him to the dignity of provost of the chapter. The lucid simplicity with which Monsignor Sarto exposed his points carried the minds of his hearers straight into the heart of the truth which they were considering. The boys were never tired, never puzzled, his instructions being eminently practical and within the grasp of his audience. His aim was to inculcate a real and solid piety which would endure throughout the troubles and temptations of life. It is not everybody who knows the art of appealing to the young. It was one in which Monsignor Sarto excelled. In the September of 1884, Monsignor Apollonio summoned Monsignor Sarto to the bishop's private oratory. He received a letter from which he got to know that he was nominated to become the Bishop of Mantua. He wrote to Rome protesting this nomination, saying that he was incapable and worthless. However, his arguments were not accepted. Monsignor Sarto was consecrated bishop on the 16th of November 1884. Mantua was said by the Italians to always have been a fighting city. When Sarto became bishop, the situation was still similar. The task was no easy one. There was infighting between the priests and the people. Certain parishes even lacked priests. The seminary of the area was almost empty, and also, to add some fuel to the already burning fire, no synod had been held in the city for many years. In a little time, he started the reform. He found 147 new seminary students who wished to become priests. He sold his sole property, a few fields at Riese, to provide the necessary facilities for the new students. He called together a synod in Mantua in no time. Schools and confraternities were established everywhere throughout the diocese. The bishop's day was a strenuous one. At 5 he celebrated Mass in his private chapel and went straight to his confessional in the cathedral. After breakfast, which consisted of a cup of black coffee and a mouthful of bread, he began the oft-interrupted day's work, for he would have no set hours for receiving visits. Those who wanted him were admitted at any hour and received with the most genial kindness. No matter with what faces they go in, it was said of his visitors, they always come out smiling, that is, unless they have done something dreadful. On these occasions, the bishop could scorch the offender with words of fire, but at the first sign of repentance, he was ready to forgive, to lift up the sinner and set him on the right road. Towards evening, he would take a walk in the town, speaking familiarly to all he met. At 9, he said the rosary with the members of his own household, after which he worked or studied till midnight. Mantua under Sarto became a city of peace. 31st of December 1891 witnessed the death of Cardinal Agostini, Patriarch of Venice. Monsignor Apollonio was appointed to the see for some time, but due to his worsening health, he was forced to resign. Now the Bishop of Mantua, Monsignor Sarto, was nominated to the position by the Pope. Cardinal Rampolla, knowing the great humility of Sarto, reminded him that another refusal would very much grieve the Holy Father. In 1893, Monsignor Sarto became Patriarch of Venice. For 16 months, however, Sarto was unable to occupy his see. The Italian government refused to sanction his appointment. The cardinal first met his mother at Riese after returning from Rome. In the September of 1894, the Italian government had no choice but to concede to the Vatican due to the growing indignation of the people of Venice. God is driven out of politics by this theory of the separation of church and state, wrote the new patriarch in his letter to his flock. He is driven out of art by the degrading influence of realism, from the laws by a morality which is guided by the senses alone, from the schools by the abolition of religious instruction, from Christian marriage now deprived of the grace of the sacrament, from the poor hut of the peasant who, groaning under the burden of poverty, is taught to disdain the help of him who alone can make his hard life bearable, from the palaces of the rich who are no longer taught to fear the eternal judge who will one day ask from them an account of their stewardship. We must fight this great error of modern times, the enthronement of man in the place of God. The people, on the other hand, were the total opposite of the anti-clerical government. They welcomed Sarto in the most magnificent manner possible. Throughout his patriarchate, he managed to keep friendly relations with the municipality of Venice. Here again, as was his custom wherever he went, an emphasis was put on religious instruction. He used to say, "There is too much preaching and too little teaching." His two sisters and his niece kept house for him as there were no servants. Cardinal Sarto also called together a Eucharistic Congress, a gathering of clergy, religious, and laity to bear witness to the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. It was not long after becoming patriarch that he reformed the church music thoroughly in his see. He sought the assistance of Don Lorenzo Perosi, a skilled musician, for this sake. The fearful and wonderful performances of string orchestras, dear to the hearts of many, were banned, as was the use of drums, trumpets, tambourines, and whistles. No instrument but the organ was to be used in the churches, and even that was to be subordinate. The words of the Mass were to be sung to the Gregorian chant with solemnity and dignity, and by men and boys alone. He prohibited the singing of the tantum ergo in theatrical style, abolished singing by women, the use of the piano and other noisy instruments, and recommended choirs in which the voices of boys might take the treble parts. Although unflinchingly firm in everything that concerned the faith and the rights of the Church, the frank courtesy of the Patriarch and his conciliating spirit kept him always on good terms with the government. He bade his priests and people respect all lawfully constituted authority, recognizing that the powers that be are ordained of God. "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's," he would often say. He never sent anyone away. He received everyone who came, listened to all, and gave away whatever he had. To save a soul, he was prepared for any trouble or sacrifice, and although his hours of audience were regulated according to certain rules, nevertheless his Venetian children could find him at any hour of the day, always certain of receiving aid, protection, and comfort.
Accetti la tua elezione canonicamente avvenuta a Sommo Pontefice, accetto in croce.
The news of Cardinal Sarto's election spread with rapidity of lightning throughout the whole of Christendom, arousing everywhere universal applause and enthusiasm. The Italian press found but words of praise for the saintly prelate elevated to the highest dignity in the Church, and all these judgments were impressed with an air of sincere admiration and respectful deference. He could no longer go to his beloved poor, but the order was given that they should come to him. Sunday after Sunday they were gathered, parish by parish in the courts of the Vatican, to hear from the lips of the Pope himself a simple sermon on the gospel of the day. France, during the pontificate of Pius X, was run by anti-clerical, anti-Catholic Freemasons. Laws had been passed to prevent any sort of religious influence in education. No one has any idea what a noxious and insupportable creature is the anti-clerical in the provinces, wrote a Frenchman in the Journal des Débats. Always eager to accuse others of fanaticism, he is the bitterest and most oppressive of fanatics himself. Under the mask of free thought, he would like to prevent his neighbor thinking differently from himself. He is an aggressive persecutor, malignantly meddling in things which do not concern him, attacking or denouncing honest folks, public functionaries, or others with whose consciences he has nothing to do, threatening them on account of their opinions, which he calls subversive because they do not agree with his own. If he be a town councillor or in any similar position, he uses all his influence to set up irreligion as a standard of citizenship. The separation of church and state had been one of the primary aims of the Freemasons in France, but they faced a problem. If they did it immediately, there would be an uproar. They had to tread carefully so as to do it in a manner in which it seemed as if Rome was to be blamed. In the end, they did it. The separation of church and state was enacted by the French in 1905. Let it be clearly understood, we do not ask the members of your government to go to Mass, although we regret that they do not. All we ask, since they pride themselves on recognizing nothing but facts, is that they should not ignore one very considerable fact: the existence of a Catholic Church, its constitution, and its head, which we at present happen to be. The separation of church and state was the signal for open war on the church. Law after law was passed, making it more and more difficult for the priest to minister to the people. He was forbidden to enter a hospital unless his presence had been formally demanded by a patient. He was forced to serve his time in the army in the hope that his vocation might be ruined. He was forced to pay rent for his own presbytery, although he was often poorer than the poorest of his parishioners. Many of the beautiful old churches of France fell gradually into ruins, overused for other purposes than worship. The more degrading the purpose, the better. The Pope refused to consecrate the bishops proposed by the French government and instead consecrated 14 French bishops who were appointed by the Pope himself. The result of all of these? M. Georges Fonscrive, wrote in 1918, "After the passing of the separation law, all the orders of the Pope were immediately executed. At one word from him, our bishops and priests gave up their palaces and their presbyteries and abandoned all their goods. The religious life is everywhere increasing in depth and in intensity. Faith is no longer looked upon as a suspect, but as a friend." Pope Pius X was also faced with the question of relations between the government of Italy and the Vatican. In 1870, the position of the Pope in Rome was uncertain after Rome was annexed by the Italian forces. In 1886, the Holy Father Pope Leo XIII declared that Catholics shouldn't vote in the Italian elections as a protest. This came to be known as non expedite. There was doubt among Catholics as to the current relation between church and state. The great confusion which thus arose in the minds of Italian Catholics was the occasion of frequent appeals to the authority of Pius X and begging for direction and a decision. With regard to the political aspect of the case, the clear and precise decision of Pius X was for the maintenance of the principle laid down by his predecessor, while in its practical application, it directed the bishops of the various dioceses to decide in individual cases whether the participation of Catholics in such elections was opportune or not, adding, however, that when in opposition to a subversive candidate of socialistic or anarchical tendencies, it was not only opportune but became a duty in the conscience to take part in the election and aid towards the selection of a candidate who would stand for good order. That was not the end of it. Then again his pontificate had to face the Portuguese Revolution of 1910. Here again was a government in place that was bitterly anti-Catholic and anti-clerical. They expelled religious orders and took all their buildings and belongings. Nuns were forced into state prisons, priests were arrested and persecuted. A bishop was driven from his diocese. In his encyclical Iam Dudum in Lusitania, Pope Pius X condemned the evil practices of the Portuguese government. He praised the steadfastness of the Portuguese amidst all these difficulties. He condemned the law of the separation of church and state as one that reduces the church to shameful servitude. What offered some consolation was the fact that many of these unjust measures seemed to be relaxed during the following years. This was followed later by yet another anti-clerical revolution in Mexico. Priests were shot or thrown into prison, bishops were forced to leave their country, churches became barracks, and the sacred vessels were used as drinking cups in bars. All of these could not but cause grievance to the heart of the Holy Father. He tried all he could to bring back peace in Mexico. The Catholic republics of Colombia, Chile, and Peru offered to help. However, little could be done to solve the anarchy in Mexico. The party leaders were ready to break promises as often as they made them. The pontificate of Pius X faced the heresy of Jansenism. But what is Jansenism? Jansenism was an early modern theological movement within Catholicism, primarily active in the Kingdom of France, that emphasized original sin, human depravity, the necessity of divine grace, and predestination. Of course, this might not strike as heresy to some, and a detailed explanation of what Jansenism actually is seems necessary. The heresy can be summed up as a denial of man's participation via the exercise of his free will in his salvation and the inevitable consequences which follow from this. Jansenists hold that concupiscence, the tendency towards sin, always defeats the will in a fallen state. In those to whom God gives his grace, the will is equally powerless against this grace. The soul without grace will always be defeated by sin and thus be damned, while the soul with grace will always be overwhelmed by it and thus be saved. While it is possible to hold this much and stay within the realm of orthodoxy, Jansenists further insisted, contrary to orthodox Thomistic understanding, that God actively destines some to receive grace and actively destines others to be without it. One conclusion is that God will damn those who sin even though they were never given grace to resist sin. Conversely, those who receive grace cannot resist it and cannot avoid the workings of grace, that is, sanctification. A fundamentalist would say they are eternally secure. Thus men are left out of the loop of their salvation, locked into a destiny which they cannot alter. The bull Cum Accessione, 31st May 1653, condemned 5 propositions which were as follows. Some of God's commandments are impossible to just men who wish and strive to keep them, considering the powers they actually have. The grace by which these precepts may become possible is also wanting. In the state of fallen nature, no one ever resists interior grace. To merit or demerit, in the state of fallen nature, we must be free from all external constraint, but not from interior necessity. The semi-Pelagians admitted the necessity of interior preventing grace for all acts, even for the beginning of faith, but they fell into heresy in pretending that this grace is such that man may either follow or resist it. To say that Christ died or shed his blood for all men is semi-Pelagianism. The thing about Jansenism is that it drove sinners away from the church from which they were supposed to receive grace. Frequent communion was unacceptable until and unless you are the holiest of men as per Jansenism. Pius X had, in his very first encyclical E Supremi, calls for the restoration of all things in Christ, and one of the means towards this goal is frequent receiving of the sacraments. Later, on the 20th of December 1906, the decree concerning frequent and daily communion decided to take the question into hand and to solve all further problems. Moreover, the desire of Jesus Christ and of the Church that all the faithful should daily approach the sacred banquet is directed chiefly to this end, that the faithful, being united to God by means of the sacrament, may hence derive strength to resist their sensual passions, to cleanse themselves from the stains of daily faults, and to avoid these graver sins to which human frailty is liable, so that its primary purpose is not that the honor and reverence due to our Lord may be safeguarded, or that it may serve as a reward or recompense of virtue bestowed on the recipients. Hence the Holy Council calls the Eucharist the antidote whereby we may be freed from daily faults and be preserved from mortal sin. Of course, the Holy Father was not saying that someone who is in a state of mortal sin can receive communion. Rather, he is saying that although freedom from venial sin is to be desired, it is sufficient that the communicant is free from mortal sin. A later decree also fixed the age of First Communion at about 7 years of age. Holy Communion is the shortest and surest way to heaven, were the words of Pius X to the confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament. Here we come to Modernism, a heresy that Pius X has been known and criticized for suppressing. In his encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, he wrote of the Modernists as follows: "The Modernists put their designs for her ruin into operation, not from without, but from within. Hence the danger is present almost in the very veins and heart of the Church, whose injury is the more certain, the more intimate is their knowledge of her. Moreover, they lay the axe not to the branches and shoots, but to the very root, that is, to the faith and its deepest fires. And having struck at this root of immortality, they proceed to disseminate poison through the whole tree, so that there is no part of Catholic truth from which they hold their hand, none that they do not strive to corrupt." He went as far as to call Modernism the synthesis of all heresies. But what exactly is Modernism? Modernism is many things, and it is difficult to define into a single concrete idea. However, we will use the encyclical just mentioned above to draw out the core tenets of this heresy. The very first heavy blow came to the Modernists on the condemnation of certain books of Abbe Loisy. John Ireland writes of one of Loisy's books as follows: "But where was their blame for Pius X and the congregations? Read Autour d'un petit livre, and tell me what is left therein of the doctrine of the Incarnation and the Redemption, what is left therein of the divine origin of the Church and the sacraments. Either Loisy was to be condemned, or Pius X was to fold his tent and hide himself and his illusion of a divinely established church into the nebulous regions of a fable. Next came the decree Lamentabili Sane in 1907, and finally the masterpiece, the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis. Tracing the origins and the causes of modernism, the encyclical lists a false sort of curiosity and pride as the principal reason for modernism. Pride sits in modernism as in its own house, finding sustenance everywhere in its doctrines and an occasion to flaunt itself in all its aspects. It is pride which fills modernists with that confidence in themselves and leads them to hold themselves up as the rule for all. Pride which puffs them up with that vainglory, which allows them to regard themselves as the sole possessors of knowledge and makes them say, inflated with presumption, "We are not as the rest of men," and which, to make them really not as other men, leads them to embrace all kinds of the most absurd novelties. It is pride which rouses in them the spirit of disobedience and causes them to demand a compromise between authority and liberty. No, truly, there is no road which leads so directly and so quickly to modernism as pride. The Oath Against Modernism, published by Pius X in 1910, reads thus: "Finally, I declare that I am completely opposed to the error of the modernists, who hold that there is nothing divine in sacred tradition, or what is far worse, say that there is but in a pantheistic sense, with the result that there would remain nothing but this plain simple fact, one to be put on a par with the ordinary facts of history, the fact, namely, that a group of men, by their own labor, skill and talent, have continued through subsequent ages, a school begun by Christ and his apostles." The main error of modernism lies in subjecting the dogmas of the Church to change, an idea that the doctrines of the Church, and this includes the teachings of Church, on morality like marriage and abortion, which have been infallibly proclaimed and taught, can change with the progress in science, with the progress in the world, and can take a meaning that was contrary to what was previously understood. Pius X, just like his predecessor Leo XIII, laid great emphasis on the importance of Thomas Aquinas and his philosophical system and commanded that it be taught in Catholic institutions. He opposed vehemently the various philosophical systems that came to prominence in the 19th century, as he knew very well that these were the very philosophies that led to modernism. A friend of Pius X was furious over the words used against the Pope by a modernist writer. The Pope replied to him saying, "Did not he allow that after all I was a good priest? Now of all praise, that is the only one I have ever valued." In his first encyclical, E Supremi, Pius X says, and rightfully so, that a noble and worthy priesthood is one of the requisites for the restoration of all things in Christ, which was the motto of his pontificate. "The priest is the representative of Christ on earth," he said on one occasion to the students of the French seminary in Rome. "He must think the thoughts of Christ and speak his words. He must be tender as Christ was tender, pure and holy like his Lord. He must shine like a star in the world." And it was not as if Sato, from the moment of receiving holy orders till his death as the head of the most holy apostolic and Catholic Church, never embodied the necessary virtues to be found in a priest to a high degree. The man who all his life had curtailed his hours of sleep in order to study had done it to perfect his priesthood, to fit himself to cope with the dangers that were abroad, to be armed at every point against error. Although his enemies were never tired of asserting that he was ignorant and unlettered, and he himself was quite ready to let the world believe it, his knowledge and the extent of his learning could not be concealed. Those who came in contact with him and with his personal work could not be otherwise than impressed with his depth of thought, the extent of his reading, his literary and classical training, and his strong grasp of philosophy and theology. His wide and far-reaching appreciation of men and things in different countries all over the world was astonishing in a man who had not traveled, as many statesmen often remarked. He read French perfectly, although he felt shy at attempting to speak it for want of practice. He was an excellent accountant, refined in manner and in gesture, the delicacy and nobility of his dealings with others were. Pius X introduced a uniform catechism in Catholic schools. He issued a new breviary. The Roman Curia was also reformed. The canon law was reformed and codified due to his efforts by his successor, Benedict XV. When Donna Rosa Sato, the Pope's elder sister, passed away, those who went to pray beside her were amazed at the humble surroundings that prevailed there. A small room, a common iron bedstead, a sweet, almost transparent old face framed in a plain white cap, violets scattered here and there over the white recumbent figure. The funeral took place at the Church of St. Lawrence without the walls, the Requiem Mass being celebrated by Monsignor Zampini. All the cardinals in Rome were present together with a great crowd. The Pope alone could not be present. From the 22nd to the 25th of July, 1914, the 25th International Eucharistic Congress was held at Lourdes under the pontificate of Pius X. There was a huge procession of distinguished prelates, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and clergy. Every country, including China, Japan, and Canada, had sent a representative.
Il 28 giugno di quell'anno, un esaltato studente serbo, assassinando l'erede al trono austro-ungarico, colpì a morte anche l'Europa.
The Holy Father wrote, "While nearly all Europe is being dragged into the whirlpool of a most deadly war, of whose dangers, bloodshed, and consequences no one can think without feeling oppressed with sorrow and alarm, we too cannot but be anxious and feel our soul rent by the most bitter grief for the safety and for the lives of so many citizens and so many people for whose welfare we are supremely solicitous. Amid this tremendous upheaval and danger, we deeply feel and realize that our fatherly charity and our apostolic ministry demand of us that we direct men's minds upwards to Him from whom alone help can come, to Christ, the Prince of Peace and man's all-powerful mediator with God. Therefore we do exhort the Catholics of the whole world to turn, full of confidence, to His throne of grace and mercy, and let the clergy lead the way by their example, and by appointing special prayers in their respective parishes under the order of the bishops, that God may be moved to pity and may remove as soon as possible the disastrous torch of war, and inspire the supreme rulers of the nations with thoughts of peace and not of affliction." Night and day he prayed, trying to think of some way of bringing peace out of the conflict. During the night of Wednesday the 18th, he became very much worse, and at 8 o'clock in the morning was declared to be seriously ill, though the doctor had not given up all hopes of recovery. A few hours later it was announced that the Pope was dying. The Cardinal Secretary of State and those of the cardinals who could be present, hastily summoned, knelt around him, unable to restrain their tears. The Pope lay, or rather sat, propped up with pillows and breathing with difficulty. His sisters were by his side, a brother of St. John of God in attendance as nurse. His last words were, "I resign myself completely." At around 1:15 a.m. on 20th August 1914, Pius X passed away. The body of the Pope was first kept in the Sala del Trono and then later moved to St. Peter's Basilica, where it was placed in the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament. A huge crowd had come to visit him. According to the Pope's request, his body was not embalmed. Later, when his body was exhumed on 19th May 1944, his body was found to be miraculously incorrupt. On his tomb was this inscription, which means, "Pope Pius X, poor and humble of heart, undaunted champion of the Catholic faith, zealous to restore all things in Christ, crowned a holy life with a holy death, 20th August AD 1914. He was beatified by Pope Pius XII on 3 June 1951 and later canonized on 29 May 1954 by the very same Pope. Pius XII wrote of his predecessor, Pius X, Bishop of Rome, whom it has been our great joy to enroll in the list of the saints, following closely in the footsteps of his divine master, took that command from the lips of Christ and strenuously fulfilled it. He loved and fed. He loved Christ and fed his flock. He drew abundantly on the heavenly treasures which our merciful Redeemer brought to the earth, and distributed them bountifully to the flock, namely, the nourishment of truth, heavenly mysteries, the munificent grace of the Eucharistic sacrament and sacrifice, charity, earnestness in governing, fortitude in defense. He gave fully of himself and of those things which the author and giver of all good things had bestowed on him. The boy who grew up in the tiny village of Riese was now Pope Saint Pius X.